smooth transition. That was nice. Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. I am Gabby Ochoa, Network Manager here at the Community Impact Network. Thank you for joining us. We have a large group on Zoom, so please be interactive on the Zoom. We'll also take some questions throughout the training on our Zoom. We will also have some people trickle in. That's completely fine. Please help yourselves to breakfast. This meeting today is ID and birth certificate training presented by the Ashrei Foundation and St. Xavier. We have been talking about this for years. So many of you from our nonprofits work with transient community, as well as immigrants, as well as population that is new to the area. And so it is a very convoluted system. We're so excited to have found some people that really can give us some guidance on where to start with these populations. This is something that is very near and dear to me as well. So I'm so excited for this training. But welcome, Sara, and welcome, Christine. Thank you, guys.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and good morning to the folks in this room. And I know there's a lot of people on Zoom as well, so we're glad that you are participating however you're able, and we hope to invite and include participation from Zoom as well. So please know that you are welcomed in both spaces this morning. If we could just go to the next slide. My name's Christine Dragonette. I'm the Director of Social Ministry at St. Francis Xavier College Church. We have a weekly Missouri Photo ID and Birth Certificate program. We've operated for over 30 years now in some form or fashion. I have not been there since the beginning, supporting people with getting official documents that they need in order to access jobs, housing, all of the things you need to live your life. So we'll talk more about the direct program that I run, and the work that Sara does and our coalition that we run together. But first, I'm going to give Sara a chance to introduce herself.
Good morning. My name is Sara Ruiz. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director of the Ashrei Foundation. We're a relatively new organization located in North City. We started just 2 years ago, and this has been our flagship and sort of cornerstone program that we've done in partnership with College Church. And so we'll talk more about that as we go. Thanks.
So first to start, we just wanted to give you a sense of where we're headed today. We hope you are coming into this with whatever lens you have in the work that you do, wearing the hat of your experience, the experiences of the folks that you work with, because we know that this issue impacts a lot of different communities in both common ways and unique ways. So we hope that through this training today, you can both have a new deepened sense of this issue and also even consider maybe how you could apply this work to the world that you are in. So the first part today will be sort of the overall grounding. We're calling it ID Access 101. If that academic language does not speak to you, you can just call it part one. This will be just an intro to identification access, why it's important, what the barriers are, how we can work to overcome those barriers, both directly and on a systems level. And we'll talk a little bit about our advocacy work. And then in part two, we hope you'll stick around, that this will be we're calling it the 201 or the part two, where we will really get into the ins and outs of the nitty gritty. What do you need in order to get a Missouri Photo ID? What do you need in order to get a birth certificate? How can you support folks that you're working with in getting those documents? So this will get into some of those really specific on the ground questions that you might have. So we hope you will stick around for that, and we will take a break in between. So that's where we're headed today. And if we could go to the next slide, we will get into it. All right, this is part one. We can go to the next slide. So we introduced ourselves. We also would love for you all to introduce yourselves. We know that we don't have time to go around and hear from everyone individually, but we do want everyone to kind of have an opportunity to enter into the space. So we are going to ask you to, if you're in the room in person, to turn to a neighbor, groups of 2 or 3, If you're on Zoom, to participate via the chat as you are able, we would love for you to share your name, your pronouns, if you'd like, the organization or agency you're representing, if any. And then we really want you to think about this question. When was the last time you needed to use your ID? So thinking about your driver's license, non-driver ID, maybe it was your another form of official identification. When was the last time that you needed to use official ID? So we're gonna give you 5 minutes. We are gonna time it, and we're gonna ask, 2 minutes. We're gonna give you 2 minutes, and we are gonna time it. So just make sure that both or all people have a chance to share if you're here in the room, and on Zoom, we'll look out for your participation in the chat.
Oh, actually, that's a lie. I used mine yesterday, copied it so that I could apply for a photo ID again. 1 minute left. Awesome. Thank you. Let's come back together. My timer's going off. Yes. May I have a next slide, please? So as we continue, let's think about, I would love for you to share out, and if Gabby or someone could help me share out some of what was shared on Zoom. When did you last use your ID? What did you hear?
Sure. Yeah, I'll kick it off here on Zoom. We got a lot of responses.
Great.
Someone used their ID recently to access a correctional facility. Someone else used their ID at a bank recently, and someone else used it at the doctor's office.
Thank you. A couple folks from the room, what did you hear or use? Yeah. Used it for travel. Great. Yeah. Pharmacy for prescription medication. Thank you. One more I heard. Wow. So using it to prove your identity for credit card transactions. Awesome. If I could have one more click. As you probably all know, I think that the ID is something overlooked and sometimes hidden, but is such a central point of access to a multitude of services. So we heard some of them already named today: prescription medication, medical care, medical treatment. I heard, I think, jobs and employment, right? Banking, financial services, building credit, going to school. How many of you have young kids that are in school needing birth certificates, right, to go to school, to register for school? Registering to vote, voting in Missouri, you need a photo ID in order to vote, a specific one. We'll talk about that in a minute. Housing, you need a photo ID to sign a lease. to get a mortgage, all those things. And you also need it for some short-term emergency services, including emergency housing, transitional housing facilities, sometimes even food shelters. I think one of the most jarring food services, food pantries, one of the most jarring things I remember is hearing about the Detroit water crisis in Flint, Michigan, and needing an ID to access the water that was the clean water that was being provided for you, to make sure that you were in the right jurisdiction and were eligible to receive free water when the city had polluted it. So it is fundamentally part of American society at this point. Next slide, please. But like I mentioned, it is the hidden crisis. And our dear friend, Kat Calvin, who is an attorney and an activist and founder of a national organization called Project ID, author of a great book called American Identity in Crisis. They've done some great work. 26 million American adults don't have an ID. 26 million. That's nearly 12% of the entire population. So when we think about other kinds of statistics about what is impacting people who live in the United States, I'm thinking like heart disease, car accidents, like all of those sorts of things. The quantity of people that are impacted by this, it grossly outweighs the amount of attention and care that we are doing and giving to the fact that without this, all of those people are blocked from accessing multiple basic needs and even exercising basic rights. Next slide, please. As part of our collaborative work, we have asked people in Missouri who are coming to photo ID programs, why do they need an ID, right? And so this maps on to what we've just discussed. So the overwhelming majority of folks report that they need an ID to get a job or to maintain a job, right? That's number one. Number two, right behind it, is housing. Getting into housing, signing a lease. I spoke to a woman who was gonna lose Section 8 housing because she didn't have a valid ID, so she needed that to stay in the housing, right? So ending and preventing homelessness and all of that. Public benefits, right? To get SNAP, to get food stamps, to get sometimes Social Security benefits, cashing checks, medical, basic services, legal services. And our most recent polling last month from our photo ID guests, nearly 30 to 40% said they needed it to vote. And we're coming in to get an ID to vote, which is a specific, hot time of year to be talking about such things. But people who need all of these things also encounter significant barriers to getting the ID that is needed to access those things, right? So if we could go to the next slide, in the same survey, we have asked people about barriers, and I am gonna pass to Christine. Sorry.
If we could go back just one click, I'm gonna hide the answers first and ask for your feedback. So as part of the same survey that Sarah's referencing, all of our direct programs, so our program, Sarah's program, and some of the other programs that we've supported and worked with across the state, we just invite program guests to answer optional questions just so we can learn more about what their experiences are, and we're not making assumptions based on our anecdotal experience. And so this survey data comes directly from those surveys. So I'm gonna ask you all first, either in the room to name some ideas or in the chat on Zoom to just type some ideas. What are, maybe from your experience or the experience of folks you've worked with, or just some ideas you might have, what do you think are some of the barriers that folks face to getting official identification? The required documentation. Transportation. People don't know where to go or where to get it from. The cost. Yes, homelessness, nowhere to receive mail because they don't have an address. Gabby, is there anything in the chat?
Time.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, you all have named just about everything on this chart. So if we could go to the next click. Money is always the biggest thing we hear. It's something that I personally would not think twice about. $18 for a non-driver Missouri ID, more for a driver's license, $15 in Missouri for a birth certificate. These are costs that if you don't experience having a low income or no income and a lot of competing needs, it can be hard to understand just how much that financial piece matters, not to mention the underlying costs that are not even those direct costs. But money is the biggest reason we always hear that people are finding it challenging to get IDs and birth certificates, followed by the required documents, just the very first thing that was said here. It can be confusing. It's confusing for anyone to navigate this process, not to mention real ID versus non-real ID. We'll talk about that a little bit in part 2. Just navigating that process is challenging. Having the documents is challenging. Different communities are impacted in different ways, but for example, people re-entering after incarceration. We often hear, and some of you have probably seen and experienced, that folks often are released with no documents or with really limited documents. So piecing those documents back together, people leaving intimate partner violence and maybe their documents are withheld from them, people who are unhoused and living in really vulnerable spaces where they're likely to have their documents stolen or misplaced or whatever the case may be. Having those documents is a really huge one. Transportation was mentioned. In St. Louis, it's even challenging to get around, even if you have access to public transportation. That is a challenging system to navigate, and that takes a lot of time. And we also work with partners across the state in more rural parts of Missouri where transportation is challenging in a whole different way. So that's a big one. Proof of residency is maybe a specific subset of the required documents that was named. If you don't have proof of where you live or stay, or if you don't live or stay in one place, that can be impossible to prove. Health or disability is one that I don't want to overlook. Being able to access the physical buildings that you need to be able to go to and navigate that process, understanding the process, and then childcare is mentioned as well. So being able to do all of this with children that you're responsible for. I should mention that you will receive these slides. I should have said that up front. So you will get the slides after this. Any questions or comments about any of that? Okay. Great. So if we could go to the next slide. So just to kind of finalize this section and really underscore the barriers, there's a great group called the Movement Advancement Project, or MAP, who did a really wonderful report on ID barriers. It's the ID Divide study, which you can find online and we'll link, I think, in our follow-up materials. But they have summarized through their research 5 kind of categories of systemic barriers to ID access. And you can see they kind of map on a little bit to what we hear from folks. But just to kind of solidify those, the burdensome documentation requirements, often these are like the catch-22s. You need an ID to get an ID. You need your social security card to get your ID. You need your ID to get your social security card. Maybe you were born out of state. And there are 50 states, and there are territories, and there are consular reports of birth abroad. There's any number of different birth certificate processes. Maybe you weren't born in the US, that's a whole different process. So those documentation requirements can be a lot to navigate, as we discussed. We talked about the cost, and just to really solidify those primary and secondary costs. So both the cost of the documents themselves, but the cost of the time that it takes, the cost of transportation, childcare, taking time off work, all of those things play into that cost piece. The third category is limited availability of ID services. This varies from place to place. There are some offices that hold some Saturday hours or maybe are open a little bit later, but for folks with full-time responsibilities, it can be really challenging to get to an ID office at a time that you're able. Physical accessibility of offices. This is something that our coalition, which we'll talk more about, has been really looking into, is there's no way to apply for a photo ID in Missouri other than by going in person to an office. So for folks who are unable to leave their homes, that can be impossible. Or if they're unable to leave their homes except by ambulance, that's a huge cost that is impossible for some folks to be able to pay. And we talked about transportation as well. The fourth piece, confusing patchwork of policies. This plays a little bit into the documentation requirements, but it can be just a huge challenge to navigate all of these government agencies and offices that offer these services. And then finally, discrimination. That's not one to overlook. We'll talk a little bit about some different communities who are impacted by ID barriers. And I think some communities experience that discrimination more than others. And it's important to believe people's experiences at the license offices. If there's one thing we've learned, it's that there can be any number of different experiences even at the same office. And discrimination is a really important barrier to recognize as well.
So I'm going to just zoom in and get a little bit more specific on who is impacted by these barriers, because the way they impact me looks very different than the way they impact people who live next door to me, right? And some of us would love to have a conversation about intentional design behind those systems and why certain people are being excluded, but maybe we'll save that for a post-recorded conversation. So I want to talk about Missouri more specifically. If we could go to the next, just joking, this slide please is great. So I want to talk about Missouri. In 2022, the legislature passed House Bill 1878. Does that ring a bell to anyone? Thumbs up or high fives in the Zoom. So House Bill 1878 is one of the most restrictive voter laws in the country. So it has multiple provisions. We could spend a whole nother hour talking just about this piece of legislation, and I'm not the attorney expert about that case. But there is a significant impact to photo IDs in that law. So prior to that, Missouri was a state that required an ID in order to vote. But what this law did was significantly reduce the kinds of IDs that were acceptable to vote. So now you have to have a Missouri-issued state ID or driver's license, or a federally issued ID, like a military ID or a passport, that is valid in order to vote in Missouri. You cannot use a student ID. You cannot use your mailed voter registration card and a utility bill. You can't use an out-of-state ID, even if it's valid, right? So this took a sort of a already restricted grouping of documents and made it even more restrictive. There were instantly some legal challenges brought by NAACP, ACLU of Missouri, some individual plaintiffs that were then going to be excluded. Were not going to be able to vote because they couldn't obtain an ID in time and under these restrictions, right? And so in that lawsuit, we got to hear things about, remember back when the United States had poll taxes and you had to be rich enough in order to vote? Like, if we're putting up a system now, once upon a time, right, we decided, that's not really how democracy works. You don't have to pay your way to play, right? Like, it's just should be for all and of and by and for the people. But if we're saying now that you need to have an ID in order to exercise your fundamental right to vote, then maybe we need to be having a conversation about the right to an ID. So there have been some decisions in different pieces of the lawsuits and different injunction stuff. We'd be happy to talk about it offline, but the photo ID provisions still stand. So in next month, in just a matter of days, you will need a Missouri or federally issued ID in order to vote in Missouri. There's a program that the Secretary of State started prior to House Bill 1878 that then got changed following 1878, which is now called Go Vote Missouri. So the Secretary of State sort of heard the concerns, if you will, that maybe if you have to pay to get the thing that you need in order to vote, that's the same as paying to vote. And they have a program that says that every Missourian who is eligible to vote is eligible to receive one free ID per lifetime. They've also, with some pressure, said, okay, you can renew it for free too, because some of us were saying, well, if you are expecting people to get out of poverty and change their life circumstances within 6 years or not be able to vote, like, that doesn't seem to be really helpful. We'll talk a little bit more about that program, I think, later today, but it is grossly inadequate and it is inconsistently applied across the board. So we spent time calling offices, and many license offices didn't even know that it existed, didn't even know that it was a thing. There's no signage. You will never see signage in a license office that's like, hey, did you know you could maybe qualify for a free ID? There was no mailing about it. So I would love to talk more about that, but I'm going to move us forward. I also think there's a fundamental lack of understanding about the lived reality. Let's zoom in on the cost piece once, because for some of us who were fortunate enough to be born with privilege and or have worked to get a job like the one I have, that I can say, I need to go to the DMV to renew my license, which I have to do next month. I'm going to take time off and do that. And my boss is going to say, okay. And then I'm going to go do it. And if it takes me an hour in line, great. And if I get stuck there for 3 hours, like, okay. But there are other individuals who don't have vacation time, don't have paid leave, unless we vote for it on the ballot initiative this fall. But I'm just saying that that's available. And if you are working multiple jobs, how many people do you know or serve that are working multiple part-time jobs and still struggling to make ends meet? Cost becomes an exorbitant thing, even an $18 cost or a $33. Let's say or if you have birth certificates for all your kids and you need to get them to school, then it's 15, 30, 45, right? Like real quickly. Plus, taking a time off work, do you lose your job? Do you have to pay someone to take you there? Do you have to rent a car to get there? Do you have to buy gas to get there? A woman came to our photo ID clinic yesterday and her car broke down on the way. And she called me in tears and said, can I still come? I'm gonna be late. I have to get the bus because my car broke down. And she had to do all of that and navigate all of that to get an ID, right? So I wanna talk very briefly about some population-specific barriers, right? So within this context of who is impacted, right? We know that the underlying social and economic injustices and equities in our society are exacerbated, right? They're amplified in the photo ID access space. Here's a couple of examples of why. So we've talked about low income, right? We've talked a little bit about unhoused communities or housing vulnerable communities. I want to talk about immigrant residents in Missouri for a minute. My background, I should say, I spent the last 20 years or so working in immigrant rights and immigrant justice. So we could also talk about this for a whole nother hour, but I'm going to try not to do that and happy to follow up with you afterwards. But immigrant residents in Missouri, I think, face 3 specific barriers or layers of barriers, specifically as it comes to IDs. One, I think, is language access, right? Even if if you were born here and you don't speak English well, going to a license office and trying to navigate not just the written, how do you do the research and find the things, but engaging with someone when you're trying to get the ID is extremely challenging. I think there's also a piece about, I want to talk about documents and actual access, because not everyone who is foreign born and lives and resides in Missouri is eligible to get an ID. There is not a path for everyone. And there are some people who will not, under current law, ever be able to get a Missouri ID. And I think we need to be realistic about that. If you cannot prove lawful status, so that means cannot prove it or don't have it, you cannot get an ID in Missouri, which means you can't do multiple other things that you're already doing, which means you're going to find the way to do that, right? I think the third barrier in immigrant population specifically is about the anti-immigrant culture in our state, which I want to talk about at a systems level. We can certainly talk about it at an individual level, and I have had my own share of experiences as a white St. Louis native in this city, being treated one type of way by one clerk at one office. But I want to think about the systems level, right? Those are real barriers as well. But at a systems level, we have a state government that continually passes laws, uses language, says the soft, quiet parts out loud that are harmful to immigrants in our communities. And that permeates multiple aspects of government and civic engagement, including ID access. So having things like, I have 2 last names. How does that show up on an ID? Do I have to argue and prove to you that I can use 2 last names or 2 first names, or I'm gonna hyphenate, or like all of those sorts of things, in addition to the barriers around legal status, right? So we've heard a lot about dreamers and people who have DACA, deferred action. I don't wanna go all the way into the legalese, but there are people who are lawfully present here who are protected from not able to be deported. They are allowed to be here. The US government has allowed them to be here, who, when they produce those documents at the license office, are turned away because how could every person who works at a license office be expected to understand every type of immigration document? What does that look like? How does that logistically happen? And there are people, like I mentioned, who, for example, we're hearing a lot in the news lately about new arrivals and asylum seekers. And the majority of those individuals who are coming into our communities don't immediately have any documentation that can show that they are lawfully present. And it might take months or year-ish, I think, to get a work permit, which you'll need in order to get an ID. So then we're looking at what happens when you don't have an ID and what are those barriers. I want to talk very briefly, am I doing okay on time? Okay, about another community that is more recently impacted, but also following a long pattern of discrimination at the state level, which are transgender and non-binary Missourians. So very recently, at the beginning of August, the state changed, quietly, I would say, changed the policy and removed an option that allows people to get an ID that matches their identity, right? So there was a process that someone who was a medical service provider could attest that this individual identifies and is this gender. And that was used in order to make sure that your driver's license or ID matched your identity, right? And now that has been taken away and replaced with a practice that says you have to prove that you have had a physical operation that changes your physical body in a certain and specific way in order to have that reflected on your ID. So the impact of that will mean that transgender and non-binary Missourians, for a multitude of reasons, will not have ID, and we can imagine the perpetuation of the systems of erasure and exclusion that will continue to permeate and impact trans and non-binary communities. Finally, I want to talk about unhoused Missourians. We've talked about that a lot here. Very specifically, one of the fundamental components, as my friend in the pink vest mentioned, my eyesight is not good enough to read your name, said the fundamental thing that you have to do to get a Missouri ID is prove that you live here. And standing and existing in front of you is not proof enough. You have to have something that shows that. And if you are unhoused or living in transition, jumping from couch to couch, staying in a program, coming up with that type of proof is often impossible. Thanks to the work of the coalition, which we're going to talk about next, the Missouri Department of Revenue instituted a new form that allows service providers who work with unhoused individuals to provide and enable that individual to use their agency address to receive their ID. So at our program, about 50% of the people we serve are unhoused, and more than a quarter of those people have been able to get an ID because of that form, right? Because we can say they are here and they meet this definition, they can use our address, right? But without that, and even sometimes with that, trying to find the places and agencies that know that it exists, that are willing to do it, is a challenge, right? I'm passing to you, but I had one other thought really quickly. I'm going to stop there. That's a great question. So part of what our coalition research is actively doing is comparing what it looks like in other states. And I would say there's a wide variety I'm going to confuse homebound ID and unhoused. I would say there are more opportunities for people who are unhoused having different avenues in other states. There are processes. Some states have, that we found, like specific free IDs for people who are unhoused, free birth certificates for people who are unhoused, that follows sort of like a similar process. But there are also other states that do and offer nothing, and if you can't prove it, you can't get it. I think the other piece I would add here, which I was going to say, is we're talking about IDs, but when we're talking about the underlying documents, including birth certificates, there's a whole nother set of requirements, which often include the same set of requirements for the IDs, right? So if you are blocked from getting the thing that you need to get the thing, then the layers of barriers multiply.
Great. So we're going to wrap up this section by just sharing, kind of going back to the basics of who we are and where we come from and sharing a little bit about our work. So on the next slide, I just want to emphasize that One of the ways we address these barriers is through direct support, and that's how our program at College Church started, is just through recognizing that this was a need and starting to do the work. And then the other really important piece is looking at the systems level. As we've been talking about, there are big systemic issues, and we could do the direct work forever and not make a dent in these systemic barriers. So we need to be doing both. In the Catholic tradition, we talk about the 2 feet of love and action. 1 foot is the direct support. The other foot is the social justice systems level. That's just one example of how you can think about these 2 important pieces of the work. So going to the next slide. And we'll make sure you have our program flyers so that, on just a really basic level, you can refer folks to our programs. At College Church, we, as I mentioned, have operated over 30 years. Our program became closer to what it is today in sort of the 2000s. And these days this is kind of our niche. Many of you have probably referred people to our program over the years. We are currently in the ballroom of the church on Tuesday mornings. So we have trained volunteers and staff who work with community members to navigate the process, to provide support with that proof of Missouri residency for people who are unhoused, and provide payment up to once a year for those documents. So we provide both the navigation support and the payment, and then we can also provide bus tickets to folks, which is newer and something that we really were nudged by Ashrei's work to start doing. So just on a logistical level, we take appointments and walk-ups, and I'm happy to talk more about the specifics, but that's our direct program. I'll pass to Sara for Ashrei.
Lovely. So we can go to the next slide. So the Ashrei Foundation exists to empower and activate the St. Louis community and partners throughout the state of Missouri to promote economic justice, relieve suffering, and interrupt cycles of poverty. So within that, right, when we're talking about interrupting cycles of poverty and relieving suffering, IDs have become central to that. So we are developing other programs, but certainly the focus of our attention has been in this issue that is hidden and so fundamentally important. Our office is located in the Jeff Vanderloo neighborhood in North City, where we are east of here. I'm used to being south and saying like, oh, it's up there, over here. And we run a weekly program on Thursdays, so intentionally designed with College Church so we can balance and receive overflow and be able to, better meet the needs in our community. Our program prefers appointments, and we take limited walk-ins. I will say we continue I was just looking at the data yesterday. In third quarter of last year, we saw 200 people. In third quarter of this year, we saw 400 people. So the growth is pretty tremendous, which I want to be like, great, and also like I don't want people to have to be doing this, right? And I'm glad that we're able to grow to do it. But that means we are getting to a point where we have to restrict walk-ins. So appointments are preferred. You can call or text to do that, and we're going to transition, I think, pretty soon to an automated sort of scheduling system to make it even easier for people to come. But we'll talk more about that later. So I want to shift to talk about, okay, let's bring us up a little bit. What do we do about this? Like, this is lousy. This makes life really hard for a lot of people in our community. How do we help? How do we make it better? So the same study that Christine referenced and the data that was also came from our same coalition survey, we asked people, what would make this better? People who come to our programs, who are getting an ID, what makes this better, right? And I think as Christine mentioned in the barriers, the solution is the cost, right? We want a free ID, reduced cost IDs. Something has to change so that we don't have to choose to put food on the table or buy medicine or get our kid to school or have an ID. We need it for free. I think other things that were brought up include fewer documentation requirements. Why do we need, how do we break that catch-22 cycle? If you need one to get one, something's broken, right? Let's change that so that we can enable people to get the IDs that they need to live their lives. If we could go to the next slide. I want to talk about I'm going to invite Christine to talk about the coalition and go over how we are approaching those solutions in Missouri.
Yeah, so just to kind of wrap things up on the other side, so as we've had our ID and birth certificate program for years at College Church, we started to get really frustrated at some of the patterns we were seeing and recognized that like we can do what we can do with the person in front of us, but there were limits to what we could do, and there were just these bigger issues that we couldn't quite get at. So that was really the advent of the Missouri State ID Access Coalition. So Ashrei Foundation, where Sara works, and College Church co-convened the Missouri State ID Access Coalition. We are a group that brings together stakeholders across the state. We started in St. Louis, so we're still pretty St. Louis heavy, but we've been working on building relationships across the whole state, just with this goal of breaking down those barriers. So really getting at the broader issues that we need to be able to do some more tight organizing and advocacy work in order to make some of these things better. And so we started with that special emphasis on people experiencing poverty and homelessness. And we also know that a lot of other communities are impacted as well. We have 5 main goals in our kind of strategic roadmap that are listed here. I won't go through them, but I think it's just helpful to have access to them and know kind of what we're focused on and how it maps onto both the systemic barriers that we talked about in the MAP study and the feedback that we have heard directly from our program guests. Ashrei Foundation received a grant from the Missouri Foundation for Health for 3 years, starting this year. So we've been able to hire a coalition coordinator. We've been able to kind of tighten our advocacy work, build committees to be able to get at some of these big goals. We hosted our first ID Access Summit back in September, which was really exciting. And one of the things we're able to do through that grant as well is offer sub-grants to groups who want to do direct ID and birth certificate work. So that's something that may be relevant to you all as we look towards our 2025 sub-grants. It's something we'll mention on the next slide as a specific opportunity. So if we could go to the next slide. So just to wrap up this section, we really would love for you to think about how this applies to you and your organization. So on kind of a basic level, do you know about our direct programs already? And do you have our most updated flyers? We'll make sure you have those so that if you work with people who are looking for this support, you can refer them to our programs. So that's maybe kind of the first, most basic thing. We want you to know that we exist. We want you to know that this is an issue. Taking it a step further, is this something that you could consider doing more directly? One of the things we started to realize at College Church is we see 3,000 to 3,500 people in a year, which we're really proud of. And at the same time, we can be a barrier as well because we're bringing folks into our program to get this support. People are coming from all kinds of zip codes. And so having to stop at our program first before being able to go to the appropriate offices can be challenging. And so our goal is really that more people know about this particular issue and that there's more points of access across the St. Louis region and the state, which is why we've been so excited to work with Ashrei and a lot of the other groups who have received sub-grant funding and started their own initiatives. It doesn't have to look like seeing 3,000 to 3,500 people a year. In fact, there's a lot of different models that we'll talk about in the next section, a few examples. But we would really encourage you to think about, are there ways that you can be supporting more directly the folks that you work with, rather than even needing to send them to us? On the advocacy side, we'd love you to join the coalition or just join a meeting to check it out. We'll make sure you have all the info on how to get connected when you receive the follow-up materials. And then we'd love for you to look at the Movement Advancement Project, the MAP study. And they have some really great one-pagers on specific communities and the impacts of ID barriers on those communities. So if you work with immigrants in Missouri, there's a specific one-pager that talks about that particular, those particular impacts. People who are unhoused, people with low incomes. I think there's 7 different groups that are covered there. Also thinking about just bringing this issue into your organization and opening up the conversation. As we've talked about, this is really overlooked. So is this something that you can talk to your organization about taking a position on, or even just talking about? And are there resources within your organization that you can dedicate to this? One thing that's very true is that while the cost is a barrier to folks, doing this work can be, even adding a little bit of budget towards this can go a long way. So $18 or $15 for these documents If there is even $1,000 in a budget that can be dedicated to this, that can have a big impact for folks. One thing that's a specific action item is there's something called a municipal ID that is going to be an advocacy effort post-election in St. Louis City. So if you are interested in learning more, it's basically an avenue for receiving an official government city-issued ID that can help with some of the barriers that people face to getting government ID. So if you'd like to learn more about municipal IDs or be involved with that advocacy, we'd love for you to be involved in that. And then on really a basic level, just talking to 3 people about what you learned today is a great way to just spread the word about this issue. So we'd love for you to do that as well. Looking at time, I think we need to start to wrap up and get into the next section. So just wanted to pause and see if there's any questions or comments as we wrap up this section. Oh yeah, the next slide, please. Yeah, if there's anything in the chat.
Nothing in the chat yet, but about to send a comment to everyone in Zoom. If you would like to receive information about the coalition further, I will put that in the chat, but you can also follow up with our check-in desk to sign up for those invitations to attend those meetings.
Great. Well, in that case, if we could take like a 5-minute break, we hope you'll stick around for the next section, but we'll give a little bit of break and transition time, and we'll come back in 5 minutes at 10:01. Yeah, and then the next section is more specific into the, as I mentioned, kind of what you need for what, how to directly know how to get an ID and birth certificate.
Didn't have an opportunity to grab something to eat, we still have some food, some refreshments, coffee, drinks. Please feel free to enjoy. Thank you.
I'm just going to give us a 30 seconds here. If you can wrap up what you're doing and come back, we will dive in.
All right, welcome back. If you're on Zoom, if you can rejoin us, settle back in. All right. Really grateful that so many people are sticking around for the 2 hours. Something I want to say up front is this is the section where we'll get into a lot of detail. So if you're like thinking of a specific person you're working with or have like a very detailed question or want to just talk about like, hey, I want to do this and I really just want to have a conversation, let's talk about that. Sara and I both see this as like a springboard for future conversations. So the conversation doesn't end here, it just starts here. That being said, as we're looking at time, we might need to move us along. We really do want to hear your questions and comments as we go along. So we will try to be attentive to hands raised and take pauses for any Zoom questions. So write anything in the chat. And if we have to kind of like pause and move us along, we hope you will forgive us and we'd love to talk more afterwards. So this is really just like a starter training to kind of give you a sense of what it looks like to do this work. And also, we do not expect by any means for you to commit this to memory and be memorizing this and taking everything in and be ready to go tomorrow and like start a program. So just wanted to caveat that up front because it can feel a little overwhelming. So if we could go to the next slide. Just to recall, so for our ID assistance programs at College Church and Ashrei and the other programs that exist across the state, the main barriers that we are able to target are the financial barriers, so covering the cost, and the logistical assistance, navigating that process. So those are the main pieces that we'll talk about today as part of this training. If you recall the barriers to ID, so we can go to the next slide. And one more click again. Just remembering that money is the biggest barrier that people always name. That is a big one. So we know that organizations have different capacity in terms of finances and funds. So just to think about again, if there is any possibility of budget going towards these efforts, that's something to consider. And we'll talk about the sub-grant funding that'll be available for 2025. And if you're interested in applying for that funding, let us know, and we'd love to talk about that offline as well. So going to the next slide. This is where we're going with this second section. We're going to talk about the specific document processing. We will start with Missouri birth certificates. In many ways, that is the I don't even want to say easiest because it's the most doable and like the simplest to explain. And it's often the starting place for the majority of people we work with. We know not everyone was born in Missouri, but a lot of folks in our programs were. So that's a good place to start because it's maybe a common scenario for some of the folks we work with. And then we'll also talk about out-of-state birth certificates and even out-of-country scenarios there. Then we'll get to Missouri photo IDs, and there's some very specific strict requirements there that we'll go through. We'll finally wrap up with just some basic recommendations if you are considering starting a program or an initiative related to this, just some recommendations we have. And we'll try to pause in each section for questions. Pass to Sara.
Let's do it. So most of what we are going to talk about is in the volunteer binders that we use. So if you are here in person, you received a physical hard copy of an abbreviated version, and I'm going to explain why. If you are joining us digitally, or if you are watching this recorded, or if you're in person and want this digitally, we will make sure that you have everything here. The primary point, or one of the goals that we hope to do is not reinvent the wheel. So we try to be open access to anything that we use, any of our templates, any of our tools. Slap your logo on it, change it for your context and use it, right? Like that's the goal. We don't need to be competing about this because there's 26 million Americans that can't get this. So we don't have time for that nonsense. So don't remember everything because volunteers or staff who are gonna work on this will have it all in front of you. I don't know how you would do it any other way. That's how we do it. So Missouri birth certificates. If we go to the next slide, please. One more, please. Sorry, I forgot to say that. Thank you. So there are sort of 3 basic steps to Missouri birth certificates. You need to show proof of identity, then you need to fill out an application, and then you got to pay for it, right? So proof of identity is, if we can go to the next slide, I will just talk through the details there. So the proof of identity is most commonly a photo ID. So this is catch-22 number 1. You need an ID to get the birth certificate, and you need the birth certificate to get the ID. However, in Missouri, there are multiple other avenues if you don't have an ID for how to get your birth certificate. In St. Louis City and St. Louis County, if you're going in person, you can apply and get it on the spot, and you need to show 2 things with your name on it, right? So that could be an expired ID, a work ID, a student ID, a utility bill, a piece of mail, a face sheet from a caseworker, pretty much anything that can attest to who you are will be accepted. If you are mailing it in, you can mail in a notarized application. So if the notary meets the burden of proof, which can include a credible witness or someone personally known to them, then you send in just a notarized application and the payment, and it will be mailed to you. The Vital Records Office application is basically the same in 3 formats, and actually I just saw St. Louis County has a new format, new to me format, that doesn't look like the state's form anymore. But they're basically simple. You have to write down the information of the birth record and the information of the person applying. The cost in Missouri is $15. If you're going in person, is our understanding that they take all forms of payment. If you're sending it in mail, you have to send a money order or a business check. So obviously we're not sending cash in the mail, so don't do that, and no personal checks. If you are going downtown, in the St. Louis area, as I mentioned, there's one Vital Records office in the city. It's located at City Hall. They actually recently redid it. It is a beautiful office space. If you go in those main singular doors at City Hall, it's in the back right corner in the Vital Records office. And if you are going, your other option is St. Louis County Vital Records office, which is on North Berkeley, in Berkeley on North Hanley. I said that backwards, in the public health building there. Next slide, please. So let's talk about who can apply. This is different for different states, so we'll talk about that in a minute. But in Missouri, birth records are not open. They're not public records, which means you have to be one of the eligible access persons to get it. So who does that mean? Immediate family members. That means parents, siblings, and grandparents. That does not mean cousins, aunts, or uncles. Official representatives. So if you have an attorney, a power of attorney, if you have a medical, medical proxy that's making those decisions, right? Any sort of official representative like that. Other authorized agents would be in that same sort of bucket. Sometimes caseworkers sometimes can be the eligible applying party. We've had folks come to our program and the caseworker can sort of be the in-person assistant. I don't know if they're technically the applicant in that space, but they've reported having success with that. A parent listed on the birth certificate. So let's talk about dads in Missouri for a hot minute, because if the father is not listed on the birth record, they are not eligible to receive the child's birth certificate, even if they know and have all of the information. Foster parents and step parents, usually my understanding is you have to prove the parental relationship in order to access, right? Questions? Next slide. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. I don't, at least in my experience, if you want to speak differently, in St. Louis City, it doesn't have to be like a certified copy from the court, but you need like a Xerox, a plain copy of something. Is that your understanding? That shows that there was a determination that this person has custody or is the foster parent. I think for step parents, it can also just be the marriage license. So like my husband is not the biological father of my son, but he could go in with our marriage license, I think, and get it. But other questions? Okay. Yeah, please.
One thing I would just add is that we really recommend getting to know your local office, because our experience is that working with the City Hall Vital Records Office and the County Vital Records Office, especially City Hall, because we've been working with them for so long, we can call them with questions. If we have a specific scenario, they'll let us know exactly what's what. And they're as flexible as they can be within their guidelines, which we've just had a really good relationship with them. It doesn't hurt to bring them baked goods every once in a while, as we learned at our summit. That was one of the pro tips, but we really recommend just getting to know them, because there are like really great humans that work there actually.
Yeah. So great question. The question I'm just going to repeat for the Zoom is when someone is very sure that they're born in Missouri, but the state can't find or produce proof of that. There are a couple scenarios that I have encountered in that scenario. I think Missouri I would loop into this, but I'm going to just answer your question slightly broadly. So there was a certain time in American history where certain people, specifically Black men in the South and people of color more broadly, specifically in the South, were either didn't have a right to have a birth record, or were not born in hospitals, right? Born in homes, in churches, if we go back further, born on plantations, right? Let's own our history there. And those records were often never made it to the state. We've been working with someone for not quite 9 months who is a Black man born in the 50s in Arkansas, and his birth was never recorded. So there is a whole process that is to record the birth after the fact, that then requires, like sometimes decades after the fact in this man's case, right, requires proving your existence over the time, right? So sometimes it means like prior to 1986, you could get a Social Security card without having a birth certificate and like other things. So there was a time he had a Social Security card and fortunately still has it. Sometimes school records, church records, if it's a picture of a Bible that had the birth recorded from the pastor, if it's a letter from, it gets pretty complicated. So there's a similar process in Missouri to record a birth after the fact. Question on the Zoom. Yeah.
A question we had is, where do you get a copy of your birth certificate if you were born out of the country to a parent that was in the military?
Ooh, great question. Is that in the out of state section, or should I just do that now? Great. I'm going to come back to that.
Great, thank you.
Okay. So let's move to out of state. I'm going to add another caveat here. Out of states would be ridiculous if I tried to teach you how to do out-of-state ones, because they're literally all different. There's certainly parallels, but we have a 90-page Google Doc that has like, in this state, it's this, but if you talk to this person, it's different, and this happened on this date, so maybe that. So it is just mitigate your expectations that it is different. The next slide, please. The way that we start when someone says, I was born in Michigan, I zoom in as local as we can go. We find that to usually be the most successful. So is there a city birth certificate process? In St. Louis, we have a city vital records office that looks different than the Joplin vital records office, but start with a city. Not all states have that. So then I go to the county, right? So a county might have a different set of requirements than a city. And then if all else fails, you go to the state. Some states are different, right? So in Missouri, you can get a Missouri birth certificate in anywhere in Missouri if you were born anywhere in Missouri. In other states, you have to go to the county where you were born in order to get the birth certificate there. So lots of variants. That's why we start as local as we can. I also generally anecdotally find that working with a local staff person is often easier than trying to get someone at a state level and sometimes at a county level, right? Check the specific vital records website. So we look it up every time. I make sure that what is in our Google Doc matches whatever updates were on the website. It'll usually have a mail-in process. So there's an application that you'll download. There's usually a list of documents. So sometimes, we just did this in Iowa yesterday, not for an Iowa birth certificate yesterday, where you have the application and then you have to find the list of acceptable documents. Like they're not always attached. It's somewhere linked else on the website to figure out, okay, well, you need a photo ID. What if you don't have one? You have to dig and find the list somewhere that says, well, if you don't have one, you need one of this or two of these or three of those, right? Then we have to confirm the eligibility and the required documentation. So is the person who is needing it, usually in our clinic, it's the person applying for themselves, but if it's grandma or if it's sister or my parent, then trying to figure out what are those state requirements, just like I reviewed for Missouri, what does it look like there? Sometimes out-of-state applications require notary. So on out-of-state, at our clinic, our practice is to have two people review the application. So the one person works through it and someone else gets eyes on it, because Mississippi has a darkened, like a shadowed box on their application that is the signature form. And at least 3 different times, a guest has left and I go to mail it and I'm like, it's not signed. Because you overlook a blacked out box on the form. Why would you? Anyway, so it's that sort of thing, right? You have to really look at the forms. I know this is basic, but it is important because they are all different. Sometimes they need to be notarized, sometimes not. Sometimes you have to have copies of your documents, sometimes not. So you just really have to do it. Sometimes you have to include a paid stamped return envelope, sometimes not. So you have to just review. Generally, the birth certificate is mailed to the address on the application. This is another point that you have to look, because sometimes it has to match the address on the photo ID that you send. Or if you're a social worker or someone that's been authorized to apply, it will have to match that authorized address, not where the person lives. Again, those are different, so you have to check that every time. Processing time varies by state. Who's on our poop list? New York, the worst. If someone's like, oh, I was born in New York, I'm like, I'm so sorry for you, right? Like, solid 9 months. I mean, it's awful. There are other states, and some counties in Illinois, that it's 2 weeks and we get the birth certificate. So big variance there. Again, some states have a tracker or like an estimated time frame on their website. Some states say you can call and ask. Other states, like Texas, I'm looking at you, literally never answer the phone and provide no information ever unless it's in mail correspondence back and forth. So that's super helpful. Usually we follow up. If it's like 8 weeks, that's kind of my mark of like, okay, it's been clearly more than a month, maybe pushing 2. Let's see if we can call and find out what happened. The other thing I do, so this is different between Christine's program and mine. I guess not for out of state. I follow the check tracking. So when a check has cleared my bank, that indicates to me that at least the application is in some point of process, right? And so that adds just another data touch point there. And when in doubt, just call the Vital Records office. Oh, yes, I'm going to come back to that. So next slide, please. We spend most of our time doing mail-in because usually that is the most cost-effective. But there is also an online application. There is one private company that is the official records keeper for like all of the states, or has all the contracts with all of the states, which is called VitalCheck. If you go through VitalCheck, it is sometimes quicker processing, sometimes. It is sometimes requires less documentation. How many times have you filled out something online that's like, answer these security questions, and then it's like, which of these addresses have you ever been affiliated with? Which of these cars have you ever owned? I don't know where they get the information. However, if you go through those and answer those questions, sometimes that is the proof of identity needed. So if you have someone who has nothing and can't come up with any of the documents, sometimes going through VitalCheck is helpful if you can get to that point. There's a big if there, because in VitalCheck system, you have to pay in order to play. So you pay first, then you find out if you have to upload documents or if you get security screening. So if you go that route, you have to be ready to lose the $12 Vital Check fee. The other thing about Vital Check is that it is typically 3 times as expensive as paying by mail or going in person. So there's a standing Vital Check fee, and I think there is just elevated costs for the birth certificate that the state charges Vital Check that then is passed on to the consumer. So it's maybe a pro and con. And again, we use it for people who, once you've gone through everything and are stuck, then I go there. I want to talk about the certificate of birth abroad. This was a new thing to me. I'd never done until earlier this year, but quick note on citizenship in the United States, there's 2 ways to be a citizen. You're either born in the territory or born to citizen blood. That's the easiest way. There's a Latin phrase. I'm not going to go there. That means if you were born to a U.S. citizen abroad, like on a military base, there is a separate process. There's a big fat application that is from the Department of State that you download the application. It's like a $50 fee, I'm pretty sure. You mail it in. It's much more, I would say, structured because there's like this address and then this tracking and that sort of thing. So it does have documentation requirements like needing a photo ID in order to get it, and there are limited alternatives around that. But it is possible. It is just expensive and slow. I think the one that we did took 7 months. Have you done? Okay, quicker more recently. Great. And I'm going to save the part about people who were not born here for next.
So yeah, just to say the consular report of birth abroad, you can think of it as another state process. It's basically, they have a website with the application and the specific identification requirements. To go to the next slide, we're going to talk about photo IDs next. And to go to one slide after that, the way we're going to talk about this first is to bring up something that I despise talking about, and I'm sure you all have had your own feelings about as well. Who knows the difference between real versus non-real ID? Can I see hands in the room or on Zoom? Who feels like really confident that they know the difference? Yeah, in the pink vest. Yes, so it has a star on it if it's a real ID. That is correct. Were you going to say something else? Right. Yeah. So in order to travel out of state, and one more. So it's a little complicated. So basically, just to get into it, Real ID comes from the Real ID Act of 2004. It was like a post 9/11 security measure that the federal legislature passed. And here we are in 2024, and it's just taken a couple of decades for them to actually put it into effect. And so it basically requires more stringent proof of identity in order to receive that star on your ID. So in order to receive what they're calling a real ID, which will, starting in May 2025, the implementation deadline has been kicked down the road a couple times, you may know. Some of us would be happy for it to be kicked down the road forever, but it does appear that it will actually go into effect in May of 2025. And the only difference is that a real ID will be required in order to board a plane. I'm having a hard time with the mic here. Maybe I'll go back a little bit. In order to board a plane or access a federal building. So that extra level of security for accessing those services is the basics of it. So if you have a passport, for example, you can use your passport instead of a real ID, and you can still you can fly and you can access a federal building. You still need a passport to leave the country. You can't use a real ID in order to leave the country. So just to clarify, real ID will be required for boarding a plane, accessing a federal building if you don't have a passport, starting in May 2025. But there will still be a non-real ID, not a fake ID, a non-real ID, which is a little confusing. And that non-real ID without the star will still be allowable for every other reason that you need an ID. So when we talked about at the beginning, what do you need an ID for? Most of the things we talked about, if not all of the things we really talked about then, travel I think was brought up, so that would be maybe an exception. But other than those two purposes, every other reason for needing an ID, including voting, including jobs, housing, et cetera, a non-real ID is still allowable for all of those purposes. So we just really want to make that clear because we'll talk just briefly about the difference between the two, and there's a higher burden of documentation for a real ID. We've already talked about those barriers, so you know if it's hard to get a non-real ID, it's impossible for many people to get a real ID. So there are concerns that some of us have on how that will play out. That's something we're going to set aside a little bit. We're going to focus mainly on non-real ID, because that's often what we're aiming for first. But we do want you to kind of understand the difference so that you can work with folks on real ID if they have the documents to do so, because the cost is actually the same, which is a big misconception. So when you receive your electronic materials, or if you have a physical binder, you'll see some of the checklists that I'll reference. The acceptable documents checklists that are pictured here, I don't expect you to be able to read them, but that's what they look like. Those come directly from the Department of Revenue, which is the Missouri state agency that issues driver's licenses and non-driver IDs. So that checklist comes directly from the state. So if that's the best way for you to kind of process this information, that comes directly from the source. I'll also reference there's some like flowcharts and checklists that our programs use that are kind of a simplified version of the Department of Revenue's documents. So depending on your learning style, you may prefer a flowchart, you may prefer some of the other documents, you might just like the checklist from the state. Just know that those are all available to you. So the main difference between real and non-real ID, I'll get into the specific requirements, but the main difference is that in order to get a real ID, you need not only one piece of proof of Missouri residency, but two. So we've talked about the residency challenges for people who are transient or in between places or unhoused. If you can't get one proof of Missouri residency, it can be impossible to have two. So that's a big difference there. And then we'll also talk about kind of a social security card requirement. If you've had a non-real ID in Missouri before, if you're in the system, so to speak, most often people are able to recite their social security numbers to get a subsequent ID rather than needing to show their social security card. But if you're getting your real ID for the first time, you do need to show your card. So that's another big difference. And then one other piece of clarification, both of our programs mostly focus on non-driver IDs. So there's real versus non-real IDs, and then there's driver's licenses versus non-driver. You could also get into CDL, et cetera. We're gonna leave that there for now. But the non-driver IDs in Missouri are really the thing that we focus on the most, which is mostly just a financial decision. Non-driver IDs are $18. Driver's licenses can cost up to, $30, $35, something like that. So if you are wanting to do this work, you could make your own decision about what you're able to cover financially, but there are other distinctions other than just real versus non-real. Questions about any of that? And Gabby, anything on Zoom?
Nope, nothing on Zoom. We are getting a lot of binder requests, so we will be making extra, it looks like, in the next week. So.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, we have some extra physical binders, and we'll send out the electronic version as well. All right, to the next slide. So you have I referenced the two checklists from the state that are on that last slide. This slide here just pulls out some of the most common documents just to kind of simplify it a little bit. I don't mean to erase that there are a lot of experiences outside of this kind of most common template, but I do think this is a helpful starting place. So you can see Sarah talked about the steps for getting a birth certificate. These are the sort of requirements for getting an ID. You heard Sarah say, some states you need a photo ID, but you can offer 2 secondary documents, or this person can apply for you, et cetera. Not the case for IDs. Just want to make it really clear, the state is very, very picky and specific about what documents they will accept. And so those checklists are complete versions of what they will accept, with maybe one exception that we'll talk about in proof of residency. So the first two categories are identity and lawful status. We often talk about them together because when we are working with people born in the US, the most common document that satisfies both of those categories is a US birth certificate. So if someone can get the certified copy of their US birth certificate, that will immediately satisfy the identity and lawful status categories. So often that's why we're starting with birth certificates first. It cannot be a photocopy, it has to be the certified copy with the raised seal. This is one of the hardest things I think in our program is when we're working with someone who needs their ID today for a job interview or for housing, and we have to tell them that if they were born out of state, I'm sorry, we have to mail off for your out-of-state birth certificate, and that will not come in for a number of weeks, and you'll need that birth certificate before you can apply for your ID. That's just something we really try to make sure that we're honest and clear about those expectations, but that's really challenging. So that can be one of the first hard things. If someone was born in Missouri, they could foreseeably go that same day if they have everything they need. So the other thing that does fit those two categories is a US passport, which again is less common for many of us to have, but that would satisfy that category as well. Sara will talk a little bit about, for people not born in the US, what some documentation options are. And you can see the full list in the checklist that we'll give you. Missouri residency, you'll see there's a whole long list on that checklist. It looks really long, but I do want to be clear that a lot of those things are things that are challenging to have. Obviously, if you don't have a permanent address, or if you're doubled up, like staying with a family member and don't have utility bills in your name, if you're staying one place now and then maybe next month you'll be somewhere else. I know even when I was applying for my real ID, I had moved recently and I was scrambling a little bit to figure out changing over my bank statements so that I had my current address. That's a very privileged example. I was able to get those things together, but I do just want to illustrate that utility bills, government letters, all of the things listed there are impossible for some people to have. Go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted to say. Oh boy. So people used to be able to, I don't know how I broke this, sorry. Great. I want to just talk about the proof of residency. A lot of people, I think there's a common misconception that any piece of mail will work, and it will not. So I have beef with the Department of Revenue because they have 3 different versions of the list of documents for non-real ID on their website, and they are aware of this. But what is in here has also been updated. So if you have a physical binder, we will resend the new list, because this one says postmarked envelopes, and that is no longer the case for a non-real ID. So for a non-real ID, you can use certain kinds of mail, government correspondence, so a letter from Family Support Division or things like that. But I want to make sure that you have the most accurate, and this was an oversight on my part, so we'll correct it.
And I mentioned there's one document that is not listed in the proof of Missouri residency list. That is Form 5862, which Sara referenced briefly earlier. This is the form that our coalition advocated for. That is a DOR form that allows any homeless services provider to receive an individual's ID to their address if the person's experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity. I think we have a slide specifically on that later, so we'll tell you a little more of the details, but that is not listed on there. And that form can only be used for a non-driver, non-real ID. So that's proof of Missouri residency. 1 proof of Missouri residency required for non-real ID, 2 for real ID. And then the final kind of document category to overcome is proving your social security number. If it's the first time you're getting an ID in Missouri, or if it's been since before 2013, it's kind of this one weird rule that DOR has where the last time that they kind of overhauled their system was in 2013. So if someone's had an ID in Missouri since 2013, then their social security number is in the system, so to speak, and they can just recite their social security number in order to receive a subsequent ID. If they have not had an ID ever in Missouri, or if it's been since before 2013, they will need to have proof of their social security number. That's one of the categories on the checklist from DOR. Most commonly a social security card, but can also be a W-2 or another tax document or pay stub with their full social security number on it. Has to have their name, full social security number. That's something that I would say most commonly people have had IDs in Missouri since 2013, but not uncommonly we'll work with people who have never had a Missouri ID, often youth getting their first ID, people who have moved to Missouri from a different state. And in that case, they need to have their social security card or one of those other documents, which can be really challenging. So those are all of the document requirements. Were you going to add something? Yeah, let's circle back. Yeah, we can talk more about social security cards as well, which is a whole other can of worms. That can often be one of the most challenging categories. If you don't have an ID, there are secondary documents you can use to prove your identity to apply for a replacement social security card, which is always free, but those can be challenging documents to get. And sometimes you run up against lifetime or annual limits to how many social security cards you can request. So that is a challenge as well. And the other thing I will say is that an individual needs to apply for their own Missouri photo ID. You cannot apply on behalf of anyone else. And the individual, as I mentioned, needs to be able to go into the office in person. So there are more license offices than vital records offices, but it still is challenging to get to those offices, and they're not always fully accessible. There's a new one downtown I went to recently that was just this like very crowded little space, and then there's been offices that have closed and reopened. So you do have to go in person, bring all of those documents, and then be able to pay $18 for the non-driver ID, or whatever the cost is of the driver's license or CDL, et cetera, that you need. And we talked about the free ID to vote, which should allow people to receive one fee-exempt ID, non-driver ID, if they need it to vote. But there are some issues with that program as well. Questions? What were you going to add? Questions about, I would say IDs are like the most challenging and specific. So if there's any questions or comments now, we'll pause for just a moment. And Gabby, if there's anything in the chat as well. Yeah. Yeah, honestly, we've heard 2009 and we've also heard 2013. So we often say 2013 just so it's the most conservative version of what we've heard. So 2013 is the year that we would recommend utilizing.
Our program, oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. My apologies. So the question was, what was the year that an individual needs to have had a Missouri ID in the system since in order to not have to prove their social security number? And it's 2013. So if someone's had an ID in the system since 2013, they should be able to go into the license office and need all of the other required documents, but for the social security number proof, they should be able to just recite their number rather than providing physical proof of their number.
I was just going to add to that, our program does it even more conservatively, I would say, because we continue to hear different answers from Department of Revenue about that date cutoff and when it is. And it is also my understanding that it is somewhat discretionary. So if it could be a scenario that the individual would go in and the point of sale person would say, you need a social security card, even if we've sent them in saying, if you've had it since 2009 or 2013, you shouldn't need it. Our program says in the last 10 years. So that is sort of my cutoff for that. Yeah.
One more addition before we move to the free ID to vote. I talked about building relationships with the vital records offices. I would say we find it harder to build relationships with the license offices. They tend to be harder to reach over the phone, and busier and have a lot going on. So I'll just be honest, that can be really challenging. So sometimes we've said like, oh, we recommend calling ahead to see if you'll need to prove your social security number or not. That can be really hard to do. So sometimes it's just a matter of us saying like, if this does not work, if you have any issues, here is our phone number. Please call us. Please let us know. Making sure that there's like a really tight follow-up plan if you're not 100% sure that someone has everything they need, and giving them choice. Like, would you rather apply for your social security card first to be sure, or go in and try this?
Okay, let's move to talk about free ID. Am I hearing feedback? Did I do that wrong? Did I mess it up? It sounds crackly, and I don't know if that's just me. It sounds great now. Okay, let's just move on. So we talked about free ID to vote. If we could go to the next slide, I just want to highlight two other things there. So this is supposed to, it was started as once per lifetime. They've made a verbal commitment that it can be renewed for free as well. You have to be eligible to vote in order to do it. It has to be requested from the license office. And there is, I just want to reiterate here, we hear a lot of language, and I'm so thankful that no one in the room has said the voter ID yet, because that's not a thing. We do not have a separate ID that is for voting. There's not a voter ID. You have a photo ID that you can use to vote, and it's the same ID that you use to do everything else. So even, I think this program makes that even more confusing, because people say you have to go in and articulate to the clerk that you are here to get your free ID to vote. And it is the same ID, right? So it is not a different one. You just get it for free because the state cannot block you from voting. So to that end, it requires some self-advocacy. In the binder, the coalition has created a form in the payment section. It's just a flyer that a guest can take with them so that they have something to put in front of the clerk if they need to say like, no, it's a thing, it's a real thing, here's what it is, here's the reference, here's the website you can go look, because there's still some inconsistencies with who knows about it and how to do it. To be clear, license offices cannot opt out of the program. It's not an option. And you also know the people that you work with, as do we. Not everyone who is eligible for that maybe is the best kind of candidate to walk in and be ready to wage that battle. So that's frustrating, and we end up paying for IDs for people that preserve the right to get a free ID later in life, because it is who looks bad when we send someone in to get the free ID is not the DOR, it's me. Right? When I say you have this right and here's how to do it and you can go get it, and the DOR turns them away, that comes back on me. And then you have someone who's already trying to overcome those barriers, having yet another one, and I'm not here for that. Okay, next slide. I want to talk, anything else about free ID? Was that okay?
I just wanted to add briefly, because we've done a little bit of a simplification, there are a few what-if scenarios with IDs. So like, you may know that when your ID is about to expire, you can bring in your current ID in lieu of a birth certificate to get a renewal. We find that a lot of people's life circumstances make it such that they're not coming in for like proactively getting their renewal. It's like they've lost their ID or it's been stolen. But if you or someone you work with has your ID and it's about to expire, or it just expired within the last 6 months, you can use that current or recently expired ID in lieu of needing the birth certificate for those first two categories. So there's some like what if scenarios like that, but we've told you kind of the most common overview. And there's a question in the back here. That's a great question. Does there need to be a close upcoming election in order to get the free ID to vote? No. So we know that this year, since it is a big election year, that the license offices received a very thorough, well, I don't know how thorough, they received a training from the Department of Revenue, because when we made another round of calls, every license office we talked to knew that this is something they're supposed to know about. And then when we asked some details, there were still some inconsistencies in like how it plays out. And it's clear that a lot of offices just haven't done it. But at any point in time, an individual should be entitled to receive their free ID to vote. if they haven't received it before or if their ID is expiring. And they don't have to be registered to vote either. The license office will offer voter registration, but they don't have to be registered.
Okay, next slide, please. So let's talk a little more specifically about people who were not born in the United States and how they get a Missouri ID, or if they can. I already talked a little bit about language access, and that continues to be an issue. So I included links here to the ISPN, which is the Immigrant Service Providers Network. If you're not familiar with that and you regularly serve immigrants, I would highly suggest connecting with them. There's a monthly Zoom meeting. They do an annual conference. There's a lot of resources. So there's a link for that. I'm pretty sure the website is ispnstl.org. And then the second one linked is Monarch Services STL. It used to be Bias. And they have a lot of case management services for immigrants, but also specifically around language and translation interpretation services like that. So there's a lot more that we could do. There are federal laws about when you need to have, when language access has to be provided for you. I would say generally in driver's license specifically, those are limited. You can use it to study, but everything is still mandated to be conducted in English. And so there are nuances there, and I don't want to go too deep into that black hole. I want to talk about a cautionary note about children of U.S. citizen children of foreign-born parents, because we've talked about, I know we're talking about IDs, but I want to talk about the birth certificate, because foreign-born parents who are applying for U.S. citizen children birth certificates have to show parental identification, right? The ID of the parent gets submitted with the birth certificate, and that often gets back into this cycle of a parent not having an acceptable form of ID to apply for the U.S. citizen kid's birth certificate, right? So again, I'm going to pick on Texas because I have a passport of a woman and it's expired and they won't accept it. And I have a lease agreement and a this and a that, but there's a name that uses two last names and not one, right? So it's like there's a whole other layer of making sure that the ID that they get is also applicable and might need some like you might need your kid's birth certificate in order to be able to come and circle around to get the thing that you need to get your own ID. I want to talk briefly about maybe 4 different immigration sort of agencies that you might encounter, because there's some classic federal government alphabet soup here. But I think there are multiple different types of existing in the United States if you were not born here, types of lawful status, right? And again, this would be something I would love nothing more than to talk to you about for many hours, but I'm gonna do an extremely quick explainer for this so that there's some general, maybe shared knowledge. For me, immigration status is not on or off. You're not either here lawfully or not. You're not either legal or illegal. Those aren't it doesn't look like that. To me, it looks like more like probably the slider board in the back of the room here with like, could be here, it's maybe here, and then gonna jump to look like this other thing, right? There's also, I would say in the last 5 years specifically, sort of emerged this new gray area of people who are waiting or in process for status that aren't deportable, aren't removable, but in some places aren't considered lawfully present because they don't have an approval notice from the government that says they can be here, but they have approval that says you can stay until we decide if you can be here, right? So there's this like purgatory area of not quite status, but not quite not status, and translating that into photo IDs can get really complicated. I think the other piece I want to iterate is that in Missouri, if you are not lawfully present, if you overstayed a visa, if you entered without inspection or entered across the border, right, entered without seeing a Border Patrol agent, and you are here undocumented, like 13 million people are in the United States, if you are in that scenario, you cannot get an ID in Missouri. There are some states where you can, but in Missouri, you cannot. And in fact, the Missouri legislature continues to introduce different bills like last year's or last session's 1413 that was trying to make it even more, make citizenship even more connected to an ID. So also remembering that it is not citizen or not citizen. You can be citizen, permanent resident, or a whole multitude of lawfully present statuses, and you can be undocumented, and that looks like 3 or 4 different things too, right? So that can be very confusing, and the documents are even more confusing. The biggest takeaway is, so there's Customs and Border Protection, CBP, that happens at ports of entry. So at Lambert, you'll see CBP agents, Customs, you know those from airports. It's also in the border region. ICE is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That is the internal enforcement arm. That's the largest federal police force in the United States. It's immigration enforcement. The office is downtown. Then there's immigration courts. There are several of those throughout the country. The one that applies to people who live in St. Louis is in Kansas City. And then there's USCIS, which is the like affirmative applying place. That's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So if you're here and you're asking for something else or making a request for something else, it's probably going to be through USCIS. If you're going through ICE, it's usually defensively, right? You're trying to say, I shouldn't be removed or deported. Here's why I get to stay. So this is oversimplified, but I'm going to just leave you with that. In Missouri, oh wow. When we're talking about document requirements for photo ID, and you go back to that list of documents from the Department of Revenue, if we could go to the next slide, please. I forgot that's in there. There are, we said the most common is a U.S. birth certificate, right? If you don't have that, then what do you do? I want to highlight that the other pieces there are most likely certificate of naturalization and certificate of citizenship, right? If you are not a naturalized citizen or a lawful permanent resident in the United States, lawful permanent resident you might know colloquially as a green card. If you are not those but are also here lawfully, you might have a valid unemployment authorization document, a work permit, right? So if you have that physical card, then that meets the burden for identity and lawful status. People who are recently arrived asylum seekers who are waiting for a court date that might be 2 or 3 years from now might not be able to get a work authorization card, even though we've put them in this bucket of like, oh, they're asylum seekers. They're not yet because they are not asylees yet. So I'm making sweeping generalizations. I'm happy to talk about that one-to-one. I think the other piece that we see here is if you're on a visa, you need the passport with the I-94, which is the entry permission form, if you will. And you need the visa in your valid passport as well. You have to show those things. So this gets very nuanced. Happy to talk about it. What we see most commonly is that people lose or don't have access to those documents, and it is exorbitantly and prohibitively expensive. Replacement certificate of naturalization and citizenship, one of those usually runs you about $555, right, to apply for the replacement thing. Similarly, work authorization cards also have a pretty hefty cost to just replace it. So I'm not even talking about applying for it or renewing it, but replacing it. There are fee waivers that you can ask for or support your clients through to have the fee for those documents removed. That is a hard thing to do, in my opinion, unless you are in those spaces. So like I don't train my volunteers how to do that. We refer to the MICA project, the Migrant and Immigrant Community Action Project, which is the largest nonprofit immigration service provider in St. Louis. And they can help and coach and assist people through the fee waiver process. That was a messy overview of something that feels very complicated to me, and I just want to ask for any questions real quick. I know we're running on time. Great. I'm happy to talk more immigration-specific details and happy to refer to colleagues at the MICA project to go on a case-by-case sort of evaluation if needed.
And if that's your specific area of interest, I would say both of our programs, like we cannot cover any of those fees, and there's like a woeful inadequacy of resources, if that's the right way to say that. So if that's something you're interested in engaging in more deeply, I think we'd love to talk about that too. Yeah.
I totally forgot. We talked about the 10 years, if it's had 10 years, right, when we're talking about IDs, or if you have your one and you're renewing, you don't need to show the documents again. Scratch all of that for people who are not U.S. citizens. If you are not a U.S. citizen, you have to show original documents every time. You cannot show copies of your certificate of naturalization, copies of your EAD. It has to be the original documents, and it is every time you apply or renew.
Yeah, on the next slide, I'm just going to remind us really quickly and not go into detail. I do just want to really emphasize that transgender Missourians, there is a very specific attack on their access to valid and accurate photo ID. So we talk about the right to an ID or being able to access ID, but having it be valid and accurate is a particular barrier. And we talked about the change in the form. Happy to talk more about that. But this is a really emergent issue right now that we are giving some emergency attention to since it happened so abruptly, but did just want to remind you of that. On the next slide, we also talked about the particular impact on unhoused Missourians and the proof of Missouri residency barrier. So this slide just goes into a little more detail on the form we referenced that allows providers to receive IDs to their address. We encourage you to look at the specific form that we'll send out in the electronic binders and are also in the physical binders. You probably fit into the category of homeless services provider, so it is probably something that your organization can use. So just take a look at that and remember that that's a resource as well. Next slide, please.
Man, we always run out of time. I'm so sorry. So I want to talk briefly about what does this look like applied and integrated into your work. So if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to give you a very brief overview and say that we have created a guide to this on the website. If you scan the QR code inside the binder, the front cover of your binder where it says resources, there's a link there for like a startup. And there's a whole literally 2-hour training of how to start up or integrate this into your stuff. So we're not going to do that in the next 3 minutes. But I want to say these are sort of the bucket areas of things to consider of like, how will I manage this? What do we need for that? What does it look like in our budget? All of that sort of stuff. So we have basically a question document that goes through like, here's what you might consider. The big takeaway here is this is not one size fits all. How we designed it for our program and our volunteers in our context is slightly different than how Christine's program works, very similar, and is very different from how other programs work throughout the state. There are some agencies here that have integrated case management, and photo IDs are now part of that, right? So they do the same thing. They go through all these processes and pay for it as part of the broad net of services that they pay for. There's also an agency that does like more train the trainer that exists to train other agencies how to do this. And she works in really rural communities, which is a more effective service provision model than having a one place where people from 8 different counties have to come to, right? So it can work in the ways that it makes sense for you. Christine and I are happy to independently or together schedule a time to go sort of like one by one and say, what do you need to make this work in your setting? If this is something that you see for your clients or people you serve on a regular basis, what will it take? And how can we help you get there? I think that is something that we both know while we're working on the systems level changes, people are still drowning, and 2 programs or 10 programs are not going to be enough. So we are very invested in ensuring that other people can do this too. And as I mentioned at the beginning, everything is available on our website in editable formats. You shouldn't have to feel like you're reinventing the wheel. If you're wondering, like, isn't there a thing? The answer is probably yes, and it's probably just not linked on the website. So if you're starting this and trying to figure out, how do I blah, 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 just ask, just text, just email, and we will be happy to share. Here's my template, here's Christine's, and talk through it, okay? Next slide, please, and we will close up talking about the ID Access subgrants, and then we will take questions, and I'm very sorry that we are, I know I'm trying to respect everyone's time. ID Access subgrants, as Christine mentioned, we had funding from Missouri Foundation for Health this year. We distributed $50,000. I'm confident we will have close to, if not the same amount next year, to subgrant as well. There's a simple application process. It will open on December 1st. The timeline, you have to submit by the end of January. Awards will be announced in February. So basically, it's up to $5,000 to cover the cost of ID Access program resources or support. So if that means you need binders, if you need to pay for the documents, or you have that and you need a computer or a store, fine, right? Like give us a reason to say yes to help you help people get IDs. It's a 1-year grant period or less. It could be a one-time event. It could be a weekly thing. It could be integrated. Use your creativity. If you have questions, we are hosting an information session that will be held on December 11th. So I'm going to skip, if you could please, 2 slides. And we'll just leave that one up, because if you scan this QR code for the session, subgrant info session, that takes you directly to the registration, so you can hop on the Zoom on December 11th following our monthly coalition meeting, which you are also cordially invited to attend, and we'll go through the subgrant process in detail. And that session will be recorded and posted on our website, so if you can't make it on the 11th, not to worry, we will make it all available to you. Please also consider subscribing to the coalition. That's how you'll get updates and have access and ability to collaborate with people across the state to make this better for all. Questions? So I know we're at time, but if we have questions, there's one in the back, and then Gabby, we can take anything from who's on the Zoom. Go ahead. So the question is, could a group apply for the grant to help people with higher price documents specifically? I would say yes. I think we know that there are disproportionate impacts in certain communities. And so if that means your funding needs to go to paying the federal government $1 bajillion for replacement, like great, like let's do that, because we know that's the barrier. So the focus is expanding access. If you can give an argument that says, here's what we need in order to expand access for the community we serve, we want to see it.
Just one other example of that, it's again, just the emphasis is just tell us why it's a need and just be clear on that. There's something else we kind of breezed over for time is like sometimes people need name changes for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes it says baby boy on the birth certificate, or someone's birth certificate doesn't accurately match their name. So the court costs, sometimes again, you can get fee waivers, but there are costs associated with that. Anything like that that is related to someone being able to get official identification that they need, paint us the picture, tell us why, and we are really open to creativity and welcome that.
And to be clear, it is not just a we. There's a statewide steering committee that evaluates and goes through and does the awards from a collective standpoint. So it's not just me and Christine. Other questions? Anything on Zoom? Anything else in the room? Great. The question is, how do you get a digital copy? I can tell you right now that if you go to moidaccess.org, moidaccess.org, that is the coalition website. There's a tab at the top where you click on resources or how to help, and that will take you to a page that has everything. We will add a separate section on there that will include hopefully either this training or a link to this recorded training, and specifically the PowerPoint presentation and the materials that are in your binder today. So you'll see stuff from other similar trainings and different dates and times, and all of the binder resources that we've distributed previously, but we will add, give me the weekend, and we will add this specifically labeled under today's training.